like to hear what your thoughts are about it. If I understand your thesis, such as it is, correctly, it's that the self as a stable entity, a substantial thing, is a problematic reification. And on some level, I think it's hard to disagree with, right? And I think people have been disagreeing with that for a long, long time. But I'm also going to suggest that it's hard to fully agree with. It's hard to fully agree with. And the reason is that even though the self cannot be distinguished from the search for oneself, as you say at the very end of your talk, this search, I would suggest, is not all that the self is about. And nor, I would say, is the narrative we tell about ourselves or the identity that we construct. What I make of myself is vitally important, to be sure, you know that. But who I am is not coextensive with this making, this construction. And that's because, as Freud told us, there's a lot operating behind the scenes that I don't know. So I think that implies that there's something going on before the construction takes place. It's not a thing, but it's not nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Help us understand.
Mm-hmm.
Help us understand your thesis. I want to make sure that we have it.
Mm-hmm. No, Mark, yeah.
I'm sorry, Jens. Let me mention one thing. I ought to have mentioned
Yes.
that before. We're not going to use the chat function. We're going to be using the Q&A tool. So please do start entering your questions there. And I apologize for not mentioning that before. So, feel free to raise questions. This isn't just a conversation between Jens and me. Start asking away. But go ahead, Jens.
Well, Mark, first of all, thank you very much for not just for your very kind and, as usual, warm-hearted presentation of myself, but also of the presentation and the summary of my thought. I mean, it's true. One could have done it in 1 minute, and then it would have been exactly that what you just said. But I talked to Martin, and Martin said, no, it should be at least 10, 15 minutes, and Irene said half an hour. So anyway, so I expanded this idea to 20 minutes, but let's say it's 50 minutes on the substance. The substance is indeed, why is it that we have this idea of a substantialized, autonomous, sovereign self, although it has been rejected and repudiated over the entire history of modern thinking, psychology, and philosophy so often? And why do we have a tradition that goes back in history, to the Renaissance, to Montaigne at least, who once said, this is ridiculous to assume that the self is a compact being. And at the same time, in this kind of strange dialectics, we have it still today. And my starting point was, in fact, a reading, or many readings, I should say, on the crisis, on our common sort of background event, the Corona event, and how it attacks the self, not just biologically, epidemiologically, but also physically and psychologically. And I find this amazing how often we read every day this trope. I would say it is a trope. It's a narrative, metaphoric representation of a very, very complex phenomenon. And you have just sketched this phenomenon, why it is so complex and why it's so complicated. Why is this so that there is this idea of a self, particularly when it seems to be attacked, as right now, according to a certain topic, to a certain view, a certain trope in the not only scientific and philosophical, but also political discourse? Why is it so? Well, my speculation, my hypothesis is there is something to this trope of the self, of an identity, substantial being, that is particularly needed in times of crisis, that comes up, that it is prone to a certain interpretation, the more it is attacked from the outside, the more we feel as attacked. It comes up like in a mythical transformation as something, as us. No, we have very, very many forms of this us. The Western community, the community of the Western countries, or the Northern Hemisphere, or the humanity, humankind. It's rare to find so many collective we's as in these days, and behind this is sort of ourself. This is at least something which I have found so often, and I believe there is some kind of mythological transformation going on, very, very plainly. To put it very plainly, it's something which puts this very complicated, you just pointed it out again, structure with so much going on in behind into an entity that is us. And well, at this point now, actually, I expected you to ask, so is there something else? Would there be another way to understand of the self? And then said, actually, yes, in these weeks, in the Corona time, I had time to watch again The Seventh Seal, this famous film by Bergman, and I think one could understand it, one could. It's a work of art that is open to many interpretations. My interpretation would be, there's a way to understand the human self, not in this autonomous, in this substantial, in this ontologized way, but in a way that leaves much more open, up to what we make out of it, as you just suggested. So it's not just what social cultural trope constitutes, but it's also what we do ourselves, what we attribute to it, what we add to it, what we make out of it. And this is something which I just left at the end because I knew that you would probably ask this question. But, you know, look, Bergman's film, The Seventh Seal, you have this knight, Antonius Block, and he, in a sense, doesn't believe in this myth. Whether this is historically possible or not, I mean, it's not an historical film, although the film is situated in the context of the great medieval plague in Europe. So it is a Corona story, of course. But he is someone who doesn't believe this kind of mythical transformation works. And he does it in a very Bergmanian way as an existentialist, and it's very bleak and dark and fascinating stuff. So I took this actually in an attempt to pre-formulate an answer to the question that you now asked.
Let me push back a little bit. You presented Freud at one point in a very interesting light, I think an innovative light, as a kind of social historical thinker. I'm not sure that he'd be able to sign on to your argument, though. I think he would certainly say that the specific form the self takes, insofar as it's located in cultural and history, can't be distinguished from it. But I also think he would say, given his interest in Darwin, given his interest in psychobiology and all that, that, to return to my initial question, there's something that precedes that also. And so what I make of myself as an allegedly sovereign subject is bound to lead to illusion. Hence the need for the circuitous path of interpretation and so on. So if ultimately it was, we were what we made of ourselves, it seems to me psychoanalysis would be a good deal easier than it is.
Yeah, I mean, Freud is, of course, an ambivalent figure here because he himself was deeply convinced that at the end of the day, there is some kind of a self, even if a self in crisis, and in a crisis as a permanent state. So in contrast to the slightly, ironic vignette of the self that is stable and is attacked by the coronavirus, virus, and then has to defend itself, etc., etc. In the Freudian tradition, you would never have had this stable and this solid self. You had from the very beginning a self in crisis, not only because of individual psychological ontogenetically grounded reasons, but also because the entire idea of an autonomous self wouldn't work for Freud in the bourgeois society. The bourgeois society was not a place in history where you could have this kind of ancient identity idea. and yeah, I would say Freud is very helpful in putting this into the picture. Look, we had already a few great historical paradigm shifts. The idea that we are in the center and everything is around us is since Copernicus. It's history of science, Darwin, and of course, in all modesty, Freud himself put himself in this tradition and said, you know, we aren't even masters in our own home. This is true. I think these are sort of the given conditions, the conditions under which we have to think over what then is a self, or what is it that we can make out of ourselves, or our experience, our projects of life and identity, in a way that is compatible with the cultural norms. I mean, I cannot be completely out of my culture. When I'm completely out of my culture, then I'm like Knight Block, then I'm sort of an existentialist, slightly Sartrean figure in the Middle Ages. Looks wonderful, but I'm not sure if there was such a Lord Knight Block in the medieval, in the real medieval. It was in the imagination of Bergman, in the arts, for example. The arts have always suggested alternative models to this. Sure. There are actually not very many ideas in modern arts and in modern literature that assume that the self is a compact and solid entity. These are sort of certainly not, this is not literature, word literature, where you find these figures. So these are caricatures of identities. Characters. So I would say the art is always, and this is something where indeed we're thinking of your work, has always played a very important role to keep the question open, to make sure that we don't have a definitive answer. But whenever there is someone who gives an answer, there will be a new novel that says, no, this doesn't work. You know, this is, you know, have so many people in such a complex identity mess that we cannot just say he is he or she is she, but things are much more complicated. And this insisting on the complexity, on the question that has to be asked anew and anew and anew, that it's not a question where we can expect an answer to be found at one certain moment in history. This is actually what I think should be there where the place of the traditional self is, or where the traditional self was placed.
There's so much more I want to ask you, but let's wait until later. Let's go to Michelle Ferrari, who says, wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. Agree the self can't be distinguished from the search, nor is it an entity. But here's the question.
Okay.
Most struck by the analogy to ancient mythical figure, like the ancient mythological gods, if I understood this right. We now don't think the sea and the sky are personal actors. We're no longer in the animistic phase, so to speak. Will a time ever come, even potentially, where we think the same about our individual selves? Would this not lead to a very, I assume different should be there, would this not lead to a very different world, politically, interpersonally? Would such a world be possible? Would it help with dealing with the crisis? What an interesting question. Can we move past our own continued animism, one might say?
Well, you know, I had once a teacher, philosophy teacher of ancient Greek, and we were reading philosophical text, and he personally said, I have done this sort of study all my life. I grew up in a world that was dominated by the Greek and Latin languages and by their gods and by their sphere. And, you know, I believe in the Greek gods. I don't just refer to them. I don't quote them. For me, their power is a presence in my life. So one could imagine figures, slightly eccentric figures, and I don't know, Magic Mountain, Thomas Mann, where you could certainly be playing a role. We would have this figure, but I don't think in our real modern contemporary world, it is possible to go back, I mean, even beyond the historical horizon of our imagination. So what is, I think, in a certain kind of historical psychology, speaking in terms of a historical psychology, what is characteristic of this mode, of this ancient mode of sort of the well-rounded, harmonious, autonomous identity, there's the effort, the drive, the hope, the wish, the tendency to reach stability like in the universe as a whole, and the universe as a whole in this eternal sort of regularity and permanent, the same rhythms. This is something, the background for an identity model that is stable and fixed and autonomous and grounded in itself, and therefore, as in the ancient period, that what underlies even the imagination of gods. According to Charles Taylor, this is once and forever over with, interestingly enough for him, with Christianity. The Christian self is not anymore a harmonious, stable, and compact self. This is something which lived in a world of crisis. The Christian story is a story of crisis and how to overcome a story. Modernity doesn't believe in anymore in overcoming the story, the crisis. This is the problem. We have to face the crisis as, like Bergman did, as something we have to live with. We can't overcome. So these are different historical modes or modalities or paradigms within to think of identity and self. And I don't believe in the possibility to just to transcend them and say, you know, we just act like the ancient Greeks again, or like medieval monks, or like Renaissance scholars. So we will have, if we want it or not, we will have to take the material of our days to construe a halfway believable or doable concept of identity or self.
A quick follow-up. When was there the stable self that you're referring to?
Well, according to...
When did it exist? I mean, it's... At one point, I had to break out my Freud, partly because of the attack metaphor, which he talks about in The Future of an Illusion. And essentially, he says that, you know, the archaic person, so to speak, was already under crisis in a certain sense by virtue of helplessness before the power of nature and all the rest. Consequently, the gods arise. Eventually, the gods become condensed into the form of single gods in Western monotheism and so on. So, you know, there's a certain sense in which that story suggests the self was never stable, but it was given different renditions throughout the course of history to deal with its fundamental instability. Any thoughts on that?
No, I think you're right. The self was never stable, but don't forget, this is all about historical semantics. Our semantic, our understanding of what this self means is a modern one, is today's one. The Greek, Homer had a complete different idea of a self. And for Homer was the self a rounded, a full-bodied. It was a harmonious and at the end of the day, permanent form that existed as an ideal form, one of the ideal forms described by Homer forever. It was just there, like the stars. They would not come up at one point and end. This was at least the sort of cultural imaginary, the horizon within which certain ideals were projected and negotiated. Whether many people in Greece or in Rome were able to live up to that standard and reach that, that has been, of course, much questioned, and it can be, I think, we can be doubtful of that it was not so many. It was also in ancient Greece, of course, and a highly difficult practice to become a stable self. But the ideal was there, the model, the vision, the view, the hope. And this is something we don't have anymore in modern times. You would not find a philosophical system, a musical or artistic work, a novel, or philosophical thinker who would design an idea of self and identity as a harmonious, full-bodied, self-contained, eternal being. For reasons, well, we might regret that this is not the case anymore, but these reasons, disrespected these reasons, it is the case. We don't have this. There's no, the modern self, the modern literature is a self in crisis.
Right. Right. It's interesting that you say we don't have this anymore, as if a discovery has been made that the self is no longer what we imagined it to be. But if we really want to historicize, we would have to say that the destabilized and decentered self that you're talking about, that's so visible in a lot of modern and postmodern literature, is another construction. Is another construction. But let's leave that. Just a quick follow-up, actually, to Michelle's question about whether it's possible to imagine another form. Cliff Briggy asks or says, one of my Buddhist teachers called the self a convenient fiction. It does not, quote, really exist, yet it appears. How incredibly amazing. Do you think the turn in much of kind of contemporary Western culture to Buddhist and neo-Buddhist practices and yoga, and how do you understand that kind of unselfing movement, or is it just a reselfing movement? But I don't know if that's a translation of Cliff's question.
I mean, you yourself have written a lot about this process of unselfing, about the possibilities and the options that we have in case we would like to unself ourselves. Even more, there's a certain ethical imperative, as you have written, and I find it also interesting to see that you don't think this is just a moral issue, but it's also an issue of personal forms of life, such as, for example, mindfulness,
right.
Meditation, self-awareness, forms of organizing our everyday life in a way that that is much more, maybe not, will never reach these ideals, these harmonious, full-bodied forms, but at least allows us to take off the pressure and maybe make this question less important, that it matter a bit less, and that there may be other things that are important, connections to other people, relations, experiences that bring us in contact with a world that we usually don't have so close. Art, sort of transcendence in terms of movements beyond the everyday experience. All these forms of life and reflection are certainly, I think, practical forms of de-selfing. I think, again, there is no, I mean, this is now almost like a bit in a self-help club. I don't think there's one strategy, technique, some mode, but I believe there is a certain repertoire, that, for example, Bergman used in order to use art to overcome a certain kind of mythical belief, the idea of mythical fatalism, of mythical determination, of causality, of mythical causality. This is something which is indeed, it's an ancient model as well, which would not work. But there are many other models that are being practiced and that are being imaginable in these days that allow this, what you described as de-selfing or decentering, or opening up the self and overcoming this central fixation on the self, on the Western ego, on the strong character, on the powerful personality, on the I that defines himself, herself. This is something which I believe is a model of the past. And I think tendencies towards de-selfing, decentering, opening up the relational self, the embodied self, the physical self, all that are things that right now take center stage, I believe. You're right.
Yeah, good, thank you. Let's try to move in the direction of the coronavirus. We'll turn first to Ernst Straub and then maybe Molly. Ernst asks, could the corona crisis evoke new kinds of self-questioning, which could expand our collective self-understanding in a constructive way? And I'm guessing, I haven't read Molly's question yet, but I'm guessing on the basis of her talk yesterday that she's after something similar. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, I would say the corona crisis activizes, mobilizes social and solidarity potentials that otherwise are pretty much lost in a modern capitalist society. I mean, there are certain forms of social consideration and communal organization of communal life that have come up in these weeks and months, and it's amazing how well they work and how many people even have asked themselves, why don't they work outside of such a crisis experience? Why couldn't we use them for organize many aspects of our everyday life? Or why couldn't we change the conduct of life, of our lives, in the same way, even without this external thread? I mean, this is a bit sort of an alternative model to this model that I designed, that I sketched in my my little talk of the virus that attacks the self, and now we fight back. I mean, a few people mentioned that the Spaniards, the French, the Germans, the Americans, they all have used the idea of the war in these days to combat virus. But there are other forms that also have been brought to the fore, forms of social interaction and community and solidarity, community acting that I think are much more promising than the relatively old-fashioned idea of waging wars against illnesses.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw Roger Free's talk yesterday, but he talked a lot about solidarity too. And I mean, it's a lovely idea in some ways. And as you know, I'm interested in, and I'm especially interested in the kind of special solidarity, so to speak, that emerges in the wake of catastrophic circumstances like 9/11 or a tsunami and so on. Because we often we see people come together, putting aside their pettiness and so on. But what I asked Roger yesterday is about really the multiple forms of solidarity, because as much as we are seeing in the States, people banding together and cheering health workers and being brothers and sisters, we're also seeing other forms of solidarity that are precisely oriented against that form of solidarity. So I find myself slightly less optimistic. But let's turn to Molly. So that we can see her formulation of this. Molly writes, do you think that in this time of crisis, we're seeing an enhancement of what might have classically been considered the self, me and mine, that these conditions have unwritten how very connected we all really are, constructing our arbitrary borders, though we might do? Now, I don't know, I don't want to put words in her mouth, but what I hear her saying there is it possible that this is really revealing what we are underneath or before all of the different civilizational gunk, especially wrought by capitalism, that winds up keeping those better selves at bay?
Yeah, I mean, the enhancement of what might have been, what might have classically been called the self, I mean, touches a bit on what we discussed in the minute ago on what forms of self are possible. And of course, we mentioned that many very interesting and very fascinating developments towards the idea of a more relational, more social, more interactive self, a communal self. This is ambivalent, an idea, as you just pointed out, or warned us against. This is not a solution to many problems, but it is at least a tendency in which dimensions of the self are being recalled and remembered and reactivized, and that for a long time seemed to be, forgotten, peripheral. I mean, the dominant actor, the dominant protagonist was, of course, and is still a different kind of self. I mean, the personality, the spectrum of personality ideas that has been propagated in the Western media is, of course, a different self. It's not this kind of self that Molly has in mind, but I believe she's right. There are forms in which relational, corporeal, embodied, and enacting forms of self are being discussed, and not just discussed, being practiced. Many people have changed also their ways of life in these weeks and months that I think we should see as a sort of progress in this horrible times, that there are forms along the lines that you just underlined again or made stronger, that there are in moments of crisis, moments of disaster, 9/11, you mentioned that. There are forms of solidarity, Roger mentioned that are very important, at least to us, maybe not to all people in this world, but I think most people interested in the self and the way we are interested in it, and the way we're discussing it here at this conference, they see it with, they welcome this development. You see, these are elements in this crisis that I think rightly should be enhanced and should be put to the fore, for example, in such a conference like ours.
Yeah. Let's, there's another question by Stefan, I'm not sure how to pronounce your name, Mayumdar perhaps, or Majumdar. And he wants to bring Heidegger into the picture, and I know you know Heidegger's work quite well. Heidegger spoke of the clearing, spoke of this opening up or clearing ground. And I don't know whether you see the question that Molly posed as somehow akin to what Heidegger talks about as the clearing. But Stefan goes on to ask, do we not need a specific content of being, or maybe an idea of being from which to begin?
Well, I mean, it's a very nice and very important question. This is primarily, of course, not a philosophy conference. I'm a bit reluctant to emphasize Heidegger, also because so many of his ideas have been by now transformed into elements of other philosophies. For example, this idea of the self. I think Heidegger would be, of course, a primary point of reference for this discussion that we had about the self, a self that is a relational, that is an historical self, that is an embodied self, that is a transient self, that is aware maybe more than other selves of its own transiency, of its own, the short time that he or she lives. This is something what Heidegger, of course, took as a central definition of the self. What the self is, like Bergman's block, is basically, it's a game of chess, and then the self, it's over, the game is over, and the chess and the self has lost. We can predict this, very clear. And Heidegger's thinking has, in his writing and the thinking, has certainly put to the fore these elements of our discussion. So we could basically make footnotes to many of our themes and say, you know, this refers to this idea that Heidegger had. Sometimes Heidegger, of course, means also to use a certain language, which is not very easy and conducive. But I think the clearing is something which is very, in fact, visual. It's a metaphoric. It's a deep trope that he used, and we can have certainly we can find many forms of clearing in the present corona infected world, where people use these ideas or these thoughts also to counteract. We had this this theme already. Sort of how can we act in a way that does not imply a repetition of the old self ideas and the old storylines that this, you know, we wage war against the virus, so we have to go to like gladiator and fight it, where we sort of there are different ways. There are forms of gathering and clearings, for example, that have not only a certain philosophical depth and extension, but also a certain metaphoric suggestion of suggestiveness, a compellingness. There is something to this clearing in these days that I think we have to insist on, that we stick to these elements of Heidegger's thoughts.
Yeah, just as a quick follow-up, Gordana Jovanovic just wrote a question that's related in some way, and it's a question that takes us back to Descartes. Could the self in crisis be a kind of radical Cartesian self who is in permanent doubt, who could never reach certainty, unlike the cogito? Or would it be possible to understand the self in crisis as a reminder to Descartes that he believed to find certain foundations of I at the price that he ignored other selves in his philosophy? Gordana ends by saying, your talk inspired me to some hermeneutic thoughts. Thanks so much. So it is, well, I don't want to translate it because that would just be my translation. You can see the question. and
Yes.
let me raise one other one that's related to it. Right underneath, Aneta says, thank you, Professor Brockmeier, for your speech. You said that self in crisis is self-attacked, although I know that wasn't your view, but maybe the crisis is the fuel by which the self becomes self. Those two strike me as being kind of a pair. What do you think?
Yeah, to start with the last one, Mark, I mean, the fuel, of course, we can, that's why I also played a bit with the concept of the self, with the metaphor, with the picture, the image, why I call it a trope, a mythical configuration, because it's so open, it's so resilient. We can, of course, put it in all kinds of different contexts. We can still use the same word, although we have complete different meanings. You can, of course, say this is the fuel, the self comes, or the crisis is the fuel that starts a reaction that leads to the true self, to another self, to a different self, to a richer self. Yes, I think one can see it this way. I mean, a few elements in our discussion that we just had indicate that we can see the crisis. I mean, this is sort of, I guess, standard therapeutic, psychoanalytical, also knowledge. The crisis is the starting point for restructuring, for new developments, for possibilities, and so on and so forth. I think this is true. I mean, we could here in this crisis and the forms of communal counter-organization and find elements that go beyond, but then what? Beyond the traditional idea of the self. Well, now we would start. What is actually the traditional idea of the self, what we just did, and what will be the new idea of the self? And is it, for example, is it helpful, is it conducive to still stick to this word, to use the concept, to say we found now a relational self, an open self, a communal self, an embodied self. Maybe this is not a word so helpful in this context to be used. Maybe it's overused. Simply in 2 years, 2000 years in the Western tradition of discussion, maybe we should develop different ideas. The art, and now again, refer to your work, Mark.
Agreed.
Many writers, many artists, many musicians have offered alternative models and concepts of the self that would do away with the idea of a self, which would, for example, put things much more in a fabric, in a network, in a fabric of social interactions, of experiences that can't really adequately expressed any longer by the single term, by the noun self. This is already the very concept of a communal self doesn't make sense if you consider the tradition of the self in the West. So Descartes is, of course, an interesting figure in this context because he himself insisted on this kind of ultra-radical rationalism and the mathematics of the eye, and accepted mathematics as the only plausible mode of reasoning and rationality, but at the same time wrote about his own life, a beautiful autobiographical story where he explained why things mattered to him in a way that were all but mathematical. So his this main reflection on the discours are autobiographical reflections on why he found at one point in his life to change his life. So he uses a complete different narrative mode to speak about the fundamental issues of his life and in his life, and to explain his self in a way that's quite different from the founding father of modern rationalism and mathematical methodology. So therefore, I think Descartes is an interesting figure for us. Unfortunately, I'm not sure.
What about
we'll be able to discuss his entire work right now?
I'm going to return back to the whole construction issue and have Brian weigh in and a couple of others. But it seems to me that Martin Dege's question is relevant here. He says, maybe we know very well who we are, yet we're incapable of expressing it. So in other words, maybe there is a self, but maybe because of language and culture and all the rest, it winds up being ineffable. And I wouldn't expect that Martin would want to think of that self as substantialized, but I'm guessing that he may want to think of it as real. Real, ineffable, mysterious, left to poets more than psychologists to plumb its depths, realizing that they'll never reach rock bottom, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, nicely put. What can we add? I mean, what I would like to add is that thanks to Martin, we include now more or less at the end of our little discussion, the dimension of language, of expressing the self as a fundamental dimension of what is at stake. What is at stake is certainly needs a certain language, something to be expressed by words to a certain degree, yes, but also maybe in other forms, and we mentioned a few times artistic forms, painting, music, film, dance. All these are forms that can and have, of course, expressed aspects of the human self, of the human imagination concerning the human self. And this is something which we cannot distinguish from what is at stake when we say the self, because the self is also always an issue of, can it be expressed? Are we capable of expressing? In certain languages, I don't think there are certain languages that have to be overcome. We are not capable to articulate and express all aspects of this discussion that we had tonight in using traditional language games. I think it's true. Again, Heidegger was certainly right in referring to poetry as a language that is much more appropriate, much more sensitive, much more also vulnerable to capture essential dimensions of the human existence. So all this is part of the issue. What are the languages? What is the language? What is, are we able of expressing the self? So thanks, Martin, for your question.
A couple more questions. I'm reminded of a phrase that's in a classic essay on autobiography by Gustorf, where he mentions a writer, I forget who it is, but he mentions the phrase, and in creating, be created. The idea being that through the autobiographical process, as you yourself have called it and other people have processed, the self comes into being. It's a process of formation or construction. And so two construction questions that bring us basically full circle. Jana Peters says, you talked about the idea of the self confronted with crises it has to come to terms with oneself, and this process is identity building, if I understood correctly. Could this be a positive, productive, constructive understanding or conception of crisis and its impact on ourselves? So I would ask you to keep that one in mind, especially in the context of the coronavirus. And I will have you also answer Brian, because I know he'd want you to. Is there something about the self beyond a social construction? Not unlike the one that I began with. So if you can toggle back and forth between those, we'd all be grateful.
No, I mean, of course, I completely agree with Brian's objection. I mean, this is the tenor of our discussion. There is something beyond the social construction of the self. I mean, Ian Hacking has described this inherent contradiction in the term social construction very nicely. The social construction of what? I mean, there is, of course, something what then you, Mark, a bit earlier described as something what goes on beyond those construction, or maybe to go into a Freudian topography, underneath or below in this famous house in which we are not the masters anymore, if we have ever been. So there is, of course, a lot going on that goes beyond the social construction, also because the social construction is usually used as an idea, as a model, as a constructive element in contrast to the individual construction. I mean, here we have this this enormously complicated issue. How do the individual and the social, the cultural and the personal, the psychological, the individual psychological dimension, and the historical, the sociological dimension of the self, to use the word again in lack of a better one, how do they intermingle? How do they can be thought to, as one unit? Because of course we don't have a social construction, an individual construction. And it's also questionable already, and Hacking pointed that out, that the concept of construction does fully justice to the phenomenon at stake. That maybe it's a very solid fellow, the constructionist and the construction worker, but there might be certain things that go beyond even, you know, this construction side, and that need vocabulary and sort of intellectual instrumentarium, a semantic that is a bit more sensitive.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was thinking over the past couple of days, if you want to see the ultimate construction of reality, you know, you could look to Donald Trump. And I think that level of construction is actually forcing some constructionists to rethink the limits of construction. But I'll put that aside. One other thing, since you mentioned hacking, is you're familiar with the idea of the looping effect.
Oh yeah.
And you know, so even if the self is a concept or a construct and could have been utterly otherwise, it still has effects in the world, right? And in a sense, we become constituted in and through those very constructions.
No, I think this is
that.
Sorry, Mark. Go ahead.
No.
I think this is a very nice way also to wrap up many arguments. Hacking's idea of looping effects refers to the looping movement of certain categories or models or certain intellectual constructs in relation to the reality that is captured or construed by these models. And at the same time, this constructed reality reflects, of course, the model or the concept. So we are in a certain loop. And what we tried a few times, I believe, in the last hour to we try to get out of this loop and say there are others experiences a form of complexity that don't enter this loop. So we have to open the loop. Hacking used it. This was the first meeting which he used. In the second meeting was that in defining the identity of a person in a certain way, we also, of course, constructing, or leave the word out of the discussion, forming, shaping, influencing the real development of a person. There's this famous discussion in psychiatry and in psychopathology, what happens once you have the label for a certain person suffering for something, he or she will, with the label is strong enough, will always his life suffer from this label that he has, I don't know, bipolar disorder, and whatever happens in his life, he will always be considered within this looping movement of a, maybe he tried to overcome, but he did not really. So there is always a kind of referential fiction, that there is a reality to that categorical loop and the other way around. And I think what we tried a few times tonight to emphasize is that we have to get out of this loop, that we have to sort of try to find different ways to conceive of reality as just defined by concepts, and concepts reflecting, mirroring reality. There are different forms to constitute something like the self, and we need more than just the traditional vocabulary to talk about the self.
Yeah, I think we need the other, actually. But in any case, I think
this could be almost the final word.
Yeah. Well, we're already a little bit beyond, and I was warned to end it on time, and I've already failed to heed that warning. But you've provided us with even more ideas than the ones that you began with. So I'll speak on behalf of everyone who's here and just say thank you. It's been a good hour and 15 minutes or so, and we're all appreciative for you. And I also want to just say thank you to all the participants who were there and the questions that were posed and so on. It's been a good session. And with that,
I would only add thank you to you, Mark, to your wonderful way to master these 712 issues that were brought up in this last hour, 15 minutes. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right.